And now let's talk about the UK. London is throwing a fit today. They're upset with the EU. And the bone of contention is a string of islands some 13,000 kilometers away, the Falkland Islands. The UK once went to war over them. And now Europe is stoking that old fire. The EU held a meeting with Latin American and Caribbean nations. At this meeting, Argentina brought up its old claim over the Falklands. Europe acknowledged that claim, and then they did something unthinkable. They referred to the Falkland Islands by their Spanish name. Argentina cheered. Britain was furious. Our next report tells you more.
These are the Falkland Islands. In Spanish, they're known as Islas Malvinas. But don't let the British hear you say that name out loud, or they're likely to throw a tantrum, as they're presently doing with the EU. You see, the EU officials met leaders from the CELAC countries. That's a group of 33 nations from Latin America and the Caribbean. Argentina is a member of the CELAC group, and they have an old bone to pick with the UK. Look at the map of the Falklands again. The UK is about 13,000 kilometers away. Argentina is less than 2,000. You would think that the islands are part of Argentina's territory and not the UK's. But you'd be forgetting about Britain's old national hobby, colonization. Here's a quick primer on the Falkland dispute. The British imposed their rule on the islands back in 1833, having taken them from a newly formed independent Argentina, and the islands have been disputed since. The dispute came to a head in 1982. That's when Argentina's military junta, led by Leopoldo Galtieri, tried to seize the Falklands by force. They thought Britain wouldn't do anything about some almost barren islands half the world away. But they underestimated the resolve of Britain's Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. She sent troops to bring the islands back under British control. It led to the brief but brutal Falklands War, where 649 Argentine and 255 British soldiers lost their lives. It ended with the islands still in British control. The war also led to the fall of Galtieri a few days after its conclusion. This is important, because that's the last time Argentina tried to take the islands by force. That doesn't mean Buenos Aires has given up its claim. But now, Argentina's constitution calls for a return of the islands through peaceful means only. Which brings us back to the present. Argentine representatives at the EU summit spoke about their claims on the Falklands, and the EU acknowledged their claim, as they've always done. The dispute has never been settled after all, so that's nothing new. That didn't really bother the British. It was the statement released after the summit which ruffled feathers. This is what it said. Regarding the question of sovereignty over the Islas Malvinas/Falkland Islands, the European Union took note of CELAC's historical position based on the importance of dialogue and respect for international law in the peaceful solution of disputes. Now, while it sounds neutral, notice what the islands were called. Islas Malvinas/Falkland Islands. Argentine politicians were quick to hype this up. President Alberto Fernandez put out this tweet. He said Argentina's claims to sovereignty through peaceful means and through dialogue remains intact. The country's foreign minister tweeted this. He called it a triumph of Argentine diplomacy. It sounds like a lot of chest thumping over nothing. It's not as though the EU will force Britain to hand over the islands to Argentina. But nonetheless, the British are behaving as though that's the case. After the statement was issued, British diplomats asked European Council President Charles Michel to clarify the EU's position. A host of British politicians are fuming and calling the EU petty and accusing them of stoking tensions. Even the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak entered the fray. He accused the EU of a regrettable choice of words, and he later said that the EU backed down by clarifying that their position on the islands hadn't changed. For a moment, let's ignore the irony here, that the descendant of a former colonial subject is defending a British colony. And let's look at what the EU has said. Initially, some were making fun of the British. An official said, and I quote, "The UK is not part of the EU. They are upset by the use of the word Malvinas. If they were in the EU, perhaps they would have pushed back against it." Clearly a jibe over Brexit. The other EU statements basically stated that the status quo hasn't changed and that the bloc did not take a position on the issue. Basically, the EU washed their hands off the controversy. It hardly sounds like the EU backing down or turning tail. But that may be how Sunak will want to sell this. His party's popularity is terrible, and they need any win they can get, or manufacture. And as for the British position on the islands, they say that in 2013, 99.8% of Falkland residents voted to stay as part of the UK, which is fair. But populating a disputed territory with your own citizens and then claiming the popular mandate hardly seems correct. Sometimes geography makes more sense than a referendum.